Here is a story I have never told anyone, partly because elements of the story are just not appropriate in most social situations. As a result, I've locked this away in my memory, and I rarely think about it. Fair warning, this story does involve some sketchy sexual situations, but does not describe any actual sexual acts. Now, where to begin? The year was approximately 1998-1999. I was a young gay man in my early 20s, living in a medium-sized city in the Midwestern US. This was sort of an in-between, transitional time for gay people, where in most populous areas we had enough respect to live openly, but there were still plenty of people who did not like us. It was well before the invention of smartphones, and the internet was still in the early stages of mass adoption. There were large communities online, but it was not yet at the point where most Americans were online. Online socialization consisted of chat rooms, hosted by various services like AOL or IRC servers, and message boards were still in use by large numbers of people. For gay men at that time, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Prior to the internet, and to the broader cultural changes, gay men had been stuck looking for fun in secretive and or shady places due to the inability to freely express ourselves. In the 90s it was still somewhat risky, but the internet offered a way to talk freely and relatively anonymously, without the risk of being outed or worse. For this reason it really took off in the gay communities, and gay men were a very large part of the user bases for these social platforms. It was suddenly very easy and relatively safe to find dates, friends, or just sex, and it quickly became the norm for a lot of gay men. On the other hand, being such a new communication tool for most people, we were sometimes blind to the risks. Being an attractive young man in my prime, I made liberal use of online communities to find dates. That is to say, I had plenty of hookups. My city had a decent number of chat rooms and personal message boards, and I had mostly great experiences. I met the typical assortment of good guys, closet cases, and weirdos that you'd expect. I wasn't an absolute hoe by most standards, but suffice to say that a cute gay at that time could generally have a lot more dates than your typical straight person lol. At some point during this time, I'd had some brief chat on a message board with a guy from my city. I forget his screen name, it's been over 20 years, so let's call him Slim Guy 65. This back and forth had happened on a general thread in the gay section, not in private messages, so it was visible to anyone who chose to read that thread. Nothing had come of it. But about a week later, I received an email from an unrecognized address. The email basically said, "Hey, I'm not gay, and I don't agree with the gay lifestyle. I'm here because my friend met this Slim Guy 65 person from this message board, and the guy really hurt him. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. My friend tried to tell the police, but they wouldn't do anything. I see you were talking to Slim Guy 65, so just be careful and stay away from him." Okay, that's strange. What does this person mean by really hurt him? Was his heart broken? Did he get beaten up or verbally abused or what? I responded to the email asking for clarification on what exactly happened. I never received a response. I was slightly weirded out by it, but on the other hand, it's an anonymous email from someone who doesn't respond and is vague about their warning. This could be anything. It could be some disgruntled ex trying to mess with the guy. It could be a real warning about someone gay bashing. It could be someone trolling who doesn't have anything to do with anyone. I kept it in the back of my mind but pretty much shrugged it off. Several weeks later, I had a weekday off work and decided to take to the internet to fish for some dick, as was my custom. Lo and behold, I had an email response to a personal ad. It was Slim Guy 65. He was offering to meet at his place to hang out and just have a good time. Wink wink, nudge nudge. I won't go into details, and as I recall, there weren't really many details discussed other than the small talk and intros we'd done previously. Nothing about this guy was really sounding interesting to me, but I had no other offers on this day, so I decided why not. I'll go see what this dude is about. As I typed my reply, I suddenly remembered the strange email I'd received warning about this person. I went back and reread it, still vague, still presenting more questions and no answers. Should I take this anonymous warning at face value and just ignore Slim Guy 65? I decided to go check him out anyway. His address was on a rather busy street in the middle of a dense residential area, not some shack out in the woods, and I can handle myself. If he's weird, I can just fuck out of there. Before long, I arrived at the house at the agreed time. It was a duplex-style house, with one apartment on the ground floor and one on the second floor, part of a row of several identical duplexes. It was the middle of the afternoon. There was plenty of traffic on the street and the occasional person out on their porch or in their backyard. I pulled up the driveway to the parking area behind the house, got out and knocked on the door. The guy that answered was a pretty normal, kind of mousy-looking man, probably in his 40s. Slight, slim build, soft-spoken, looked like any guy working in an office cubicle somewhere. Not really my type, but honestly my curiosity was piqued and I had nothing better to do. So I stepped inside to take a look around and gauge the situation. With the warning email fresh in my mind, I stepped into the back door, into the kitchen. It was very clean and there was nothing out on the counters, and no table and chairs or anything. That is to say, it did not look like someone was living there. It had been kept up and cleaned, but looked empty. Looking out into the apartment, I could see that it was not set up as a living space. A large window with sliding glass was between the kitchen and living room, and I could see what looked like a large table out in the living room area. E65 said something like, "This isn't where I live. A friend of mine used to run a doctor's office here. I maintain the building for him. It's private though, we have the place to ourselves." Weird. Okay. He shut the back door and locked it, with a key deadbolt, the kind that you need a key to open, even from the inside, and put his keys back in his pocket, saying, "So, what do you want to do?" At this point, my danger sense spiked. This is not a normal home, and why is he locking the door like that? It's not necessarily suspect. A lot of people have that sort of lock on their door, and the door has a window, so it even makes sense. Still, something is not right here. I can tell, and now I'm locked in. I asked him why he was locking the door like that, which immediately flustered him. He was looking rather nervous, and his voice was a little wavery and halting. Not quite stuttering, but almost. He said to him, "Well, we don't want someone to come in and interrupt us, right?" Flashing a weak, unconvincing smile. His demeanor and body language were all I needed to confirm that this guy was up to no good, or at least there was something he was hiding. I decided not to report anything because nothing would come of it except drawing unwanted attention to myself. Even in retrospect, I think that was probably the most rational choice to make. If this happened today in 2020, the law enforcement would probably be a lot more interested in it. But back then, not so much. So, live and learn. I still drove past that house once in a while in the normal course of life for several years, and I'd pay attention to how it looked. The vertical blinds were closed for maybe 5 or 6 years wherever I went past. Then eventually the blinds were down and there were decorative curtains in the window. So I assumed the place was eventually sold to someone who actually lived in it. Around 2002, maybe 2003, there was a murder of a young man on the news. He'd been found in the next state, which borders on my city, so it's not very far away. I recognized the guy from the gay community, but didn't know him personally. A friend mentioned to me something about the local serial killer. I said, "What?" He explained that a few young men had gone missing over the past year, each after being at one specific dive bar, and each being found several miles to the north past the state line, and out in the country. The case on the news matched up with that mo. My friend told me the young guy had been at that bar and left with someone the night that he disappeared. The news report didn't mention anything about a gay bar or similar recent cases, of course. I had to wonder if my acquaintance from the internet had anything to do with it. The location of the murders apparently was nowhere near that duplex. At least according to the story I was told. I never heard of a resolution to that murder on the news, or any official mention of a suspected serial killer, other than some gossip. So, that happened. However, I could tell that I was intimidating him. I was not a particularly muscular kid, but I have a larger frame. Even when I'm at my very thinnest, I will still wear size L tops and 36 waist pants, so I look big, which people tend to interpret as me being stronger than I really am. Also, I'm not a tough guy at all, but I have a resting facial expression that makes me look like a badass thug. People who don't know me often assume that I'm rough or something. I sometimes use this to my advantage while I can, because before long a new acquaintance will eventually figure out that I'm a total wimp, lol. But this was definitely an occasion to play up the tough guy appearance, and I did exactly that. I put on my best steely face and told him to unlock the door, and that I don't want to be locked in here. He looked for a moment like he was going to pee his pants. Then he said, "Okay, all right, I'll unlock this." He unlocked the deadbolt and I'll just lock the knob here. And he turned the little dial that locks the doorknob. That was fine with me. I continued to stare at him until he said, "I'll leave the keys on the counter right here." And he set his keys down near the sink. I was relatively satisfied with that answer. At this point, though, my adrenaline was flowing. I was almost in full fight or flight mode, but I was kind of stuck in place. The guy was between me and the door. I was freaked out, but this little weasel did not appear to pose any immediate physical threat to me. I could tell that his pant pockets were empty, and that I was intimidating the living hell out of him. I didn't know yet exactly what to do. Now, keep in mind that despite my wordy descriptions, this all happened very quickly, without any really long pauses. It had only been maybe 1 to 2 minutes since I had stepped in the door. This all happened at the pace of a conversation. The guy was obviously nervous and trying not to appear so. He said, "Well, let's go in," and walked a wide path around me through the kitchen into what would normally be the living room, and toward the hall to the right from there. I was familiar with this floor layout. It is very common in this area. The hallway would lead to 2 small bedrooms with a bathroom in between them. I hesitated, thinking I should just walk out that back door and take off. But really, now I was super curious. I knew there's no way in hell I'm doing anything with this guy, but I kinda want to see what's going on in here. Also, I'm confident that he can't take me if it comes to a fight, so I slowly headed toward the living room. It felt like I was walking in slow motion. From the kitchen entrance, I could see a large rectangular stainless steel table taking up a lot of the living room. I remember thinking, this looks like a surgical table. It looked like it could rise and tilt, and it had a recess channel running all the way around the edge. In hindsight, I now know what that was. It was 100% a mortician's table. Dude had a mortician's table in there, but at that time, I thought it looked like a medical table of some sort. There was some other office-type cabinets and stuff around, I think, but now all I really remember is the table in that room. The large front window looking out onto the street was covered by vertical blinds that were closed. Slim Guy 65 said something like this used to be a doctor's office. Like I said, "Come on back here." The hallway revealed the room setup that I expected. The first bedroom door was closed. The second door was open to a small, very clean bathroom. At the end of the hall was the other bedroom, which looked like, if the doctor's office story was true, had at one time been converted to an exam room. He said, "We can go in that room if you want. Go ahead, take a look." And he stayed by the other closed bedroom door. The back bedroom door was open, and I could see that the walls were covered in a honey-colored wood paneling, the type you might see in a den or office that hasn't been updated since the early 1970s. I slowly took a few steps down to that door, trying to be very aware of what Mr. Creepy was doing behind me. He didn't move. When I got up to that room, the first thing I noticed was the door had a keyed deadbolt lock, like the back door. This room locked from the outside. I wondered if there was a lever on the inside, but I pretty much knew the answer to that question without needing to check. I also saw a chair, a non-swiveling, plastic desk chair with thin metal legs sitting near the center of the room. The room had old, dark carpet, and those wood-paneled walls. I noticed that the walls were completely paneled with no windows. And I know that room had at least 1 window, probably 2. So whoever did that paneling went over the windows. There was also a phone in there, plugged in, and sitting on the floor. It was an old office phone, probably from around the 80s or early 90s. Dingy beige plastic with several buttons to manage different phone lines. Just sitting on the carpet near the wall, with a chair at a slight distance facing the phone. There was nothing else in that room. I was standing at the threshold of that room, with 1 foot slightly in, absolutely not going past that door. I looked back at Dude. He was still standing by that other door, just nervously smiling at me, trying hard to look casual, but obviously very nervous or something. He said something like, "Well, what do you?" Instead of answering, I felt around the back side of the deadbolt lock. Sure enough, nothing there but the smooth wood of the door. It also dawned on me that I did not see a light switch anywhere for the ceiling lamp. Where was the switch? Who knows? It should have been just inside the door, of course. But that original switch was covered up by the paneling. He mumbled something about not having the key to that lock. Don't worry about it. I turned back to face the guy and just said, "What is it that you want to do here?" My skin had gone ice cold as I realized that I was way way too far into this apartment. I was running through my options in my head. What is this guy going to do? He doesn't appear to have any weapon or anything in reach, but he was almost totally derailed by that. He stammered out some hot man-to-man fun, with the weakest smile I've ever seen, looking like he was just a hair's breadth away from panicking. That sounds comical, but really, that sentence was probably the most chilling part of the entire experience for me. It was the way he said it, like he had to come up with something on the fly, something that would sound plausible, and he failed. Who says that in real life? Hey, do you want to have some hot man-to-man fun? Nobody. It's something you'd see on an advertisement for a cheesy porn site or something. Some hot man-to-man fun. The buyer, quivering lips, that wasn't. I said no, I want to go. I'm leaving. He said, okay. I quickly walked past him as he flattened himself against the wall to avoid me. And I noped right out through the living room dissection area and through the kitchen to the back door, which was thankfully still not deadbolted. The keys were still on the counter. I let myself out of the door and didn't bother closing that as I saw him slowly coming to the door behind me. I deliberately walked, not ran, to my car. Looking back at the building, I could see that indeed there was a window facing the backyard area from that paneled room, but of course it was covered up from the inside. Dude was shutting and locking the back door, and I left heart pounding, skin icy cold, thinking, holy fuck, what was that? So, was this guy some kind of killer? Or was he just an awkward, closeted gay guy, with access to a sterile-looking apartment with an autopsy/mortuary table, and a windowless room that locks from the outside, with a chair and a phone, and no light switch? It's clear to me that the poor soul who walks into that room gets locked. He probably shuts off the light from somewhere and calls the phone. Other than that, it's anyone's guess what happens. I assume the friend of the judgmental person who emailed me must have been some kid that got locked in for whatever game ensues. Driving home, at first I thought, of course I have to call the police and tell them what's in that place. But thinking it through, I realized I didn't really have any crime to tell them about. I went to meet a man for casual sex, and what? He has a room with a chair in it. He has, as I thought at the time, an exam table. The police aren't going to do anything with that story. The guy didn't touch me or do anything to me, and I left. I considered calling an anonymous tip line, but again, what exactly would I report? There was no actionable crime. Also keep in mind that at that time, while the local police in this city were pretty decent, they weren't especially interested in getting involved with helping the gays. They'd prosecute actual crimes if it was cut and dry, but I'd heard plenty of accounts of them not choosing to follow up on cases where there was not an easy arrest to be made. The end. Now for story 2. It's said that we each think ourselves of the protagonists of our own stories. Take that too far and you get narcissistic people who annoy everyone around them, but there is another layer to it. In the end, we all experience the world through our own eyes, and what we see is always limited. Don't get what I mean? Imagine for a second that you were living in a simulation. Now, you may think that it's nearly impossible for a computer to possibly synthesize everything in the world going on around you. Imagine walking into a bookstore. Have you ever actually read every single book in there? No, leave that. Have you ever even opened each book? How do you know that? Each book is real, that each book actually has words in it without you opening each one. They could very well be placeholders, just there to make the world look more real. Extrapolate that to the world. In the end, of course, it's only what we experience that shapes what we think of reality. We can never go inside someone else's head. That's only what we experience that shapes what we think of reality. We can never go inside someone else's head. This would all just be a experiment. Or at least, it would be normally. 2 weeks ago, I moved into a new town. I didn't really relish the idea as it was a rather small town, a far cry from the city I'd grown up in. But I had to come here as part of a job, and my student loans weren't going to pay themselves. I sighed and grit myself for 6 months of utter boredom. That's what I thought would happen. I settled in well enough, only for my doorbell to ring the very afternoon I had arrived. Hadn't been expecting that. I hadn't even unpacked half of the boxes yet. It was my neighbor, at least that was how they introduced themselves. It was Gary, his wife, and his twin daughters. They were nice enough, though overall, given that I was eager to get to work, they were more of a distraction than anything. The visitors didn't stop there, though. The mailman, other neighbors from down the street, the owner of the local grocery store. The garbagemen, all of them felt the need to ring on my doorbell just to say hello to me. I wouldn't have minded, but the thing was that the conversations dragged on for far longer than they ever should have. And now that I truly think about it, there was something really off about each of those conversations. I know the uncanny valley effect is regarding faces, but this was like that, except for speech. What was being said was normal, but there was an oddness to it that I couldn't really put my finger on. I did notice something odd outside the window that looked over my backyard. I saw the silhouette of a lady with her dog by the road. This wouldn't be abnormal on its own, but for 3 nights in a row, I always saw her, seemingly the same place. The next morning I got up and my day was instantly ruined when I saw that all the tires to my car had been slashed. It was Gary. From the way he approached me, it was like he'd been waiting all this time behind the corner just to pop up when I would notice the slashes tires. "Yeah, someone did this," I said, in what couldn't possibly be a coincidence. The sheriff strolled right up to us as if he had just been strolling around the neighborhood. He introduced himself and assured me that he would look into the matter. And as with all the other conversations I had up till now, it lasted 3 times longer than necessary. I was really beginning to become impatient. At the time, I just chalked it up to folks from a small town being different. Though now that I look back on things, they were definitely dragging out those conversations as much as possible. Gary offered me a ride to work, which I accepted given I had no real other options. He talked a lot about his own life, only occasionally asking me questions about mine. In case you were wondering what it was that I did there, I was a reporter working on a story. I was looking into a story regarding a factory near the town, and so Gary was nice enough to drop me off at the town library, which also housed its records. It was fairly old, didn't even have a digital system in place. They still used those old cards you would write into if you wanted to take a book out. You would think that at the very least in a library I would get some peace and quiet, but no. The librarian and her 2 assistants walked up to speak to me. They shooed away the other patrons, who also seemed to want to introduce themselves, and began explaining how the library worked. Again, the conversation lasted way too long for my liking. I tried to focus on my work, but I really couldn't. I noticed that every so slightly people were waiting for me around every corner. Their faces were in books that they clearly weren't reading, as they were on the same page for 2 hours. I didn't make much headway as I made to leave, unsure of how I would even get back home, when the second I stepped out of the library I ran into Gary. "Hey there, were you waiting for me all this time?" "Oh, shucks no. Of course not. I was just in the area and remembered you didn't have a ride home. Realized the library closes around this time, so I thought I'd give you a lift." "Thank you," I said, very creeped out. On the drive back, Gary told me that there was going to be a large party over at his house tomorrow afternoon. I said I had work, but Gary told me the library was closed on weekends. I found that to be very odd, but had not real way of confirming that it was wrong, so I shrugged and said that I would be there. That night, again, I saw the lady with her dog across the street, in the same spot. I didn't think too much of it then. The next day was the party, and to my surprise, it looked like half of the town had shown up. I was immediately ushered in and asked to sit down in the center of the living room. It was as if I was the birthday boy at a kid's party. Everyone wanted to speak with me. It was nice for a while, but became quite overwhelming thereafter. That night, I again saw the lady with her dog across the street. I could swear she was in the same spot as well. I went ahead and opened the door, going for an evening stroll. I walked down the road and I saw a woman in her mid-40s walking a golden retriever. She was no longer standing still, but was walking up to me, eager to introduce herself. She walked the same route every day, she told me, and was really excited to see the new face who was the buzz all around town. The next day I tried to get some new tires, but every shop in town was out of it, and by every shop I mean the 2 there. Despite how friendly everyone was, none of them had a spare set of tires, something I found hard to believe. They did manage to find a bicycle I could borrow that was good enough to go to the grocery store and back. It took me over an hour to get to the library for my job, though Gary kept offering to drive me there, but I always refused. I did actually get some work done, and it went on like that for a week longer when my bike was stolen one day. The sheriff was right around the corner as the last time, and Gary was as willing to offer a ride as ever. Now I couldn't even get someone to lend me their bicycle anymore. That night, I saw her again. That same lady standing across the street, in the same spot. I went for a walk and she ran into me, as if she had been expecting me. I had no idea what was happening around this place. I felt nauseous and didn't come out of the house for 2 days, just whiling away time on my laptop. I had made my decision then, screw this job. I was getting out of here. I called my boss and told him I was leaving. And given I somehow still didn't have new tires, I just called for a taxi company. I'd get my car back some other way. I didn't want to live here a moment longer. The night before my planned escape, I woke up, startled by a noise downstairs. I went to see that it was Gary. He wasn't carrying a weapon of any sort and didn't look threatening in any way, but he was in my house at 2 in the morning. How did you get in? I asked him. Pick the lock. Locksmith helped, he said. I grabbed a nearby umbrella, hardly an adequate weapon, but the closest thing near me. Don't get any closer. I don't want to bother you, Gary said, seemingly nonplussed by how weird this whole situation was. I just wanted to let you know that you can't leave. That confirmed my suspicions when I heard a voice from outside. Gary, how long are you going to hog everything for yourself? We want our turn. What happened to sharing is caring. I looked outside the window and saw the townsfolk had surrounded my house. What is going on? I demanded. It's hard to explain, Gary said. But let me start at the beginning. The factory you were looking into, it wasn't a factory at all. It was a research facility for the military. We don't know why, but they made us. They made us like this, eternally trapped in this town. They abandoned us. We don't know why, just that it seems they wanted to curse us. I know no other reason as to why they should torment us so. His face twisted into a snarl. We are background characters. We have little will of our own. It's only when someone like you comes from the outside that we find our purpose. That this town of ours has life breathed into it. Did you know what my days like were before you came along? I would stand in an empty house with my family for hours on end, just staring at a blank wall, unable to eat or drink or sleep, unable to feel, unable to express myself. I can't even talk to members of my family unless you come around. I think you have a term for us, Gary said. NPCs, side characters, that's what we are. We can't do anything unless you come around. And I loved it so much when you were here for the first time in years. I felt alive. Did you know something? My house is actually empty. No furniture. Nothing at all. Everything that you saw in there on the day of the party had materialized only when you came in. I could go back home to an empty house, but I won't anymore. He began to move. Come with me. I ran upstairs and locked my bedroom door, barricading myself in as well as I could. I looked out my window and saw throngs of people there. I can hear them at my door. Any minute now they'll get in. I have family outside here, guys. I do not want to spend my life being a prisoner of whatever things live in this town. My hand is shaking in terror as I type this out on my phone. I don't know what I can do in this situation. I think I can smell smoke. They're definitely starting a fire, knowing I'll have to jump out the window. I don't know if they'll fight over me or try to tear me apart so each of them gets a piece, but they're not going to leave me alone. They may all be prisoners here, but it looks like I'll end up being another inmate along with them.